Before we get started with our introduction of our keynote, I'm going to turn things over to Kate Smith just for a minute, who is the Executive Director of the Education Law Association. She comes to this conference every year. She's been sitting back at this table, and I'll let her tell you a little bit about her organization. Thank you, Suzanne, who also happens to be our current Vice President of the Education Law Association. I appreciate that. For those who haven't met me, I am Kate Smith. I'm the National Executive Director of ELA, and it is a non-advocacy collaborative organization primarily of school administrators, attorneys, and university professors. We have a network of people across the country that report on legal issues. We have monthly and quarterly items that go out to all of our members, as well as a searchable case database of all the summaries that we create from all of that research from our volunteer network. We also provide seminars, webinars, which are included in your membership, as well as an annual conference, which this year will be held in Orlando, Florida, in a beautiful property that is undergoing a $65 million renovation that should be almost entirely complete by the time we get there in November. It is directly adjacent to Disney Springs, which you may remember as downtown Disney. So it should be a really great time for you to even bring your family down for a few days of getaway and join us down there. If you've gone past my table, you also notice that we have a number of books and monographs, and those are on very, very discounted prices. Prices even lower than our membership discount. So please feel free to stop by or give me your information to follow up with you, or just pick up a brochure or one of the things at our table and follow up with me later. So I hope to speak with you. Thank you. All right. Well, thank you, Kate. Now I'm here to introduce our keynote speaker, Mike Gregory. Mike is a clinical professor of law at the Harvard Law School, and I learned last night at dinner he is now officially appointed at the Harvard Graduate School of Education as well. He cross-lists courses and teaches in both education students and law students. He teaches and practices law as part of the Trauma and Learning Policy Initiative. It's a special program based out of Harvard Law School. So this program is a partnership, not only between the law school with a special partnership, I should say, with the Massachusetts Advocates for Children. Its mission is to ensure that children who are traumatized by exposure to violence succeed in school. Mike is a co-author of both volumes of TLPI's landmark report, Helping Traumatized Children Learn, and is also the co-author of Educational Rights of Children Affected by Homelessness and or Domestic Violence, which is a manual for child advocates. At Harvard Law School, Mike co-teaches the Education Law Clinic with Susan Cole, in which law students represent individual families and traumatized children in the special education system, and they engaged in systemic advocacy and education reform at the state level. I wish we could move him here to Indiana. Maybe he will like it so much here in Bloomington. We will. In conjunction with the clinic, he co-teaches with Ms. Cole the seminars Education Advocacy and Systemic Change, Children at Risk, and Legislative Lawyering and Education Law. Mike has also taught education law and policy and education reform movement courses. He received his law degree from Harvard Law School in 2004, and he graduated cum laude. He also graduated magna cum laude with a BA from Brown University in 1998. He received his master's in art in teaching from Brown University in 1999, and he was the recipient of the Skadden Fellowship in 2004. So we've got a pretty impressive keynote speaker today. So I also want to point out one other important point about today's keynote. So this keynote is sponsored by the Poynter Center for the Study of Ethics in American Institutions, which is part of the Future of Professional Ethics. It's a series of interdisciplinary conversations sponsored by 12 IU units, and it was made possible, this sponsorship, by the College of Arts and Sciences Eleanor Ostrom's grant program. So the School of Education is one of the partners with the Poynter Center, and they helped us. So I really want to thank especially Emma and Ken for all of their help in securing this keynote today. So thank you. I don't know if you are back there. Thank you very much for all of your help with this joint venture. pleasure, and I am going to turn it over to Mike, so thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Sadly, not to disappoint, but there's one reason why I could never move to Indiana, I think, and that's because I'm a big New England Patriots fan. So sorry to deflate your hopes, but I don't think I'll be moving to Indiana anytime soon. So I want to talk with you today about trauma-sensitive schools. And I want to say before I start that I've been an audience member many, many more times in life than I have been the speaker. And what I know from that experience is that particularly when you come back from lunch and all that food is digesting, it can be really hard to remain engaged. So what I'd like to try to do throughout the talk is build in some moments for you to talk back to me and also moments for you to talk to each other. And maybe that will help keep us all engaged and fight off those after lunch doldrums. So I'm going to start by hoping that the clicker will start to work. Let's see. We're having a clicker. Oh, good. All right. So I'm going to start by repeating but embellishing a little bit of what Suzanne just told you about me and the work that I do and where I come from. So as she told you, our program called the Trauma and Learning Policy Initiative, which is a mouthful, is a partnership between Harvard Law School and Massachusetts Advocates for Children. I want to say just a couple more words about what MAC is. Massachusetts Advocates for Children is a statewide child advocacy organization in Massachusetts that was responsible for advocating for the first state special education law in the country, which became the template for the federal IDEA, which we heard about in the earlier panels. MAC also advocated for some of the first school breakfast laws in the country, some of the first lead paint laws that require buildings and houses to not have lead paint because it poisons kids. So it's an organization with about a 45-year history of doing some really cutting-edge advocacy on behalf of children and the issues that affect them. And so about 2004, MAC formed this partnership with Harvard Law School to address yet another in this series of sort of groundbreaking and cutting-edge issues that affect kids, that issue being childhood trauma. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. Our mission is to ensure that children who have been traumatized by exposure to violence and other adverse childhood experiences succeed in school. And here's how we go about trying to accomplish that mission. The first thing we do, and Suzanne alluded to this, is we represent families in the special education system. And we teach law students how to do this. This is our education law clinic at Harvard Law School. And all of the cases that we take in our clinic are cases where the student has endured some form of traumatic experience and where the impacts from that experience are interfacing in some way with the disabilities that qualify them for special education support under federal and state law. The second thing that we do, the non-lawyers who work on our project work directly in schools, providing professional development and consultative support to educators and school leaders about how to create trauma-sensitive learning environments. And that's a term that I'm going to define as we go on in the talk. Then what we try to do is take the voices of the families and the kids that we directly represent and the voices of the educators with whom we work and bring their voices to the policy level. We spend a lot of time at the State House on Beacon Hill in Massachusetts trying to get our legislature to give schools and families the resources and the supports that they need to create environments where all kids can learn. And I think our project is somewhat unique among advocacy organizations in that we consider our constituents to be both kids and families and educators. Much of the undercurrent of a lot of the panels that we heard this morning was about the sort of adversarial or potentially litigious nature between parents and schools. And we want to try to resist that sense as much as we can in our project and really look at the places where what families want and what educators want for kids are the same, which is so often the case. And that's what we try to do in our project. Suzanne referenced the two major publications that have come out of our project, Helping Traumatized Children Learn, volumes 1 and 2. And the ground that I'm going to cover in the rest of this talk really attempts to summarize and give you the thumbnail sketch of all of the ideas and information that are in these two volumes. But if you're curious after the talk and you want to know and read more, PDFs of both books are available for free. There's a little bit of a delay. This is a website where you can download for free PDFs of both books. What I would say, and I'm actually proud of this, so I'm going to brag about it a little bit, there's more than 100,000 copies of these volumes in distribution. And that's because many states have purchased thousands of copies for professional development. Many school districts have purchased copies of these books, or printed out lots of copies from the website and used them for professional development. So these are books that seem to have really resonated a lot with educators across the country. We've had requests to translate these volumes into Dutch, German. There's been a response from around the world of people saying, gosh, trauma really is an issue that affects the kids in our school, and we want to learn more. We want to create trauma-sensitive schools. So, as I said, what I want to do for most of this talk is summarize the 5 core ideas that you will find us attempting to articulate in these 2 volumes. The first idea is that many students have had traumatic experiences. And to convey this point, I want to share with you a study. In fact, first I'm going to ask how many people have heard of this study. It's a study called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, or the ACE study. Is this a study that folks in the room are familiar with? Raise your hand. So we have a few folks who are, but many who aren't. So for those of you that know about the study, you're going to hear about it again. But I invite you to tell me what I leave out or what I get wrong, and maybe you can supplement what I'm about to share. So here's what this study was. 2 co-principal investigators, an epidemiologist, whose name is Rob Anda, from the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, and a physician named Vince Politi, who is a practicing physician in San Diego, California, for the Kaiser Health Plan, did a study in which they surveyed approximately 17,000 adults about experiences they had had as kids. And they asked about 7 experiences in particular, the experiences listed on this slide. 3 types of childhood abuse and 4 types of what they called household dysfunction. They wanted to understand what is the prevalence of these experiences in childhood. Now, the results of this survey, to many of us, the first time we encountered this study, are shocking. These are the rates of adults in this sample who expressed that they had been exposed to these various experiences listed on the slide. I mean, I don't know what your reaction is, to those of you who are encountering this study for the first time, but to understand that 20%, maybe the pointer will work here, 20% of respondents to this study said they had been sexually abused. 1 in 5. I mean, that's staggering. 28% said that they had been physically abused. Now, this isn't sexual harassment or some of the things that we talked about on the earlier panels. This is sexual abuse that involved touching. This is serious sexual abuse. That was the way they defined the survey question. So staggering numbers of people have had these experiences as kids. What's important to note about this sample is that these were folks who had Kaiser Health Insurance. It was members of the HMO who participated in this study. These were middle-class folks, educated folks, people who had jobs that were good enough to give them Kaiser Health Insurance, which is a pretty good health plan in San Diego. You can imagine what these numbers might be if the sample was skewed more toward, lower income, different types of populations. It was a largely white sample, I will also say. So, staggering amounts of adverse childhood experiences. When you look at the overall exposure, 50.5, just over half, 50.5% of the 17,000 participants in the study had at least one of the 7 experiences. Half. So what does this mean when we think about this in the context of schools? What this means is that if half of our population has exposure to one of these 7 things, every classroom, in every school, in every city, in every state in the country, has kids in it that have endured these experiences. So this is, we would argue, something that schools really need to understand and need to be supported to understand. Here's where I want to stop for a minute and just ask. And then you can just raise your hand and holler out. You saw the 7 things on the slide. Maybe I'll just go back and show them to you again. These are the 7 experiences they asked about. But can you think of, let's see here. Oh gosh, it's going in the wrong direction. Well, I just want to ask, can you think of other things not listed on the slide that we might think of as adverse childhood experiences that they didn't ask about? If you can think of one, just raise your hand. Yeah.
About students here who lost a father, son, or losing parents.
Sure, death of a parent or loved one. Yes, here.
Witnessing someone being killed.
Yes. Community violence of all forms, whether it's witnessing somebody being murdered or any kind of, community violence that we might think of. Others. Yes. Homelessness. And in fact, when you ask Rob Anda, one of the authors of this study, about homelessness, he would say, I wish we had included that on our survey, because homelessness is a big one. Yes. Any others? Here.
Recovering from a life-threatening illness.
Yeah. Medical trauma of all various kinds. Kids who have had all kinds of surgeries in childhood or have had really bad illnesses. Absolutely. Some others. And we see this in an urban area like Boston, we see this a lot. Kids who have immigrated through the refugee experience and witnessed all kinds of things in the countries that they've come from. Yes?
I think that nowadays we're calling hunger or food insecurity.
Sure. So dietary or nutritional deprivation. Yes. At the back here. Yeah, foster care is a big one. Right, and we all know that, what is it? Every time a kid gets moved, they lose 4 to 6 months of instruction. They fall behind. And many of the kids in our foster system in Massachusetts, I assume it's maybe the same here in Indiana, get shuffled around multiple times. Let me ask you this. What do you think about divorce as an adverse childhood experience? So possibly, right? In a later version of this study, they went back and asked people again. They did more surveys. They increased the N, and they asked people about divorce. And of course, when you include divorce, the prevalence goes way up. I'm mixed about divorce. My parents are divorced. I can certainly imagine lots of situations where the impact of the divorce rises to the level that it rivals some of the things on this slide. But for many others of us, it's an adverse experience in childhood, but does it really result in the kind of traumatic response I'm about to talk about that emanates from these things? I don't know. But I will just share with you that they did include divorce in a later version of the study. We're going to try to move forward here. Come to our second core idea. So again, the first idea, many students have had these experiences. Second core idea is that trauma from these experiences can impact learning, behavior, and relationships at school. I want to share a little bit more detail of that. And the first thing that I want to say, and this sort of gets back to the point about divorce, is that when we're defining trauma, it's important to make a distinction between the event itself and the child's response to that event or events. Trauma is a response to the adverse experiences that we have. And the reason that it's important to make that distinction is this. Not everybody who has the same experience will respond in the same way. There's a whole host of factors, genetics, the structure of your family. If you're witnessing violence in the community, but you're coming home to a really safe and secure family, you're going to be buffered to a certain degree from exposure to that adverse experience. So there are environmental factors that come into play. That makes some kids respond very differently. And what's really important to us is to make sure that we're not labeling kids based on experiences that they have. It's important to understand that when kids have the experiences listed on that slide and the experiences that we talked about, they may be at greater risk of some of the impacts I'm about to talk about. But we mustn't assume, just on the basis of an experience that they've had, that the child deserves a label, or that they're disabled, or that they're necessarily going to respond in the same way as someone else. So we think it's important to keep this distinction between the event and the response to the event. But what can the response look like? In the first volume of our book, Helping Traumatized Children Learn, what we did was look at all of the neurobiological, psychological, medical literature about the impacts of trauma on child development, the development of the brain. And what we found was that this research is very arcane. There's no way that educators are really going to be able to access all of the insights that this neurobiological research is giving us as a society. So what we set about to do was to take all of this arcane but really important information in these scientific journals and translate it into a vocabulary that's relevant to classroom teachers and administrators. And so what we did was categorize the research findings into three main areas. And those are the areas that you see on the slide. I'm going to say a bit more about each one. To start with academic performance, I want to do a little exercise first, and that is just to have you think to yourself about a time when you had a really stressful experience. Maybe something as simple as somebody cutting you off in traffic. Maybe something as tragic as learning that you had just lost a loved one who meant a lot to you. Or a really stressful situation in your job at work. Think about how you felt in that moment where you either got the news, the bad news, or when the thing happened to you. And try to remember, what did your body feel like in that moment? What was your breathing like? What did your stomach feel like? Did your hands get clammy, sweaty? Did your palms get sweaty? Could you think straight? My guess is that, at least if you're like me, the answer is probably no, you couldn't. Or think about this, how many times did you walk away from an argument that you had with somebody? And 10 minutes later you think, gosh, I should have said that. I should have said this. I wish I would have thought to say X, Y, or Z. I had the perfect comeback, but I couldn't think of it in the moment. Well, imagine that the stressful experience is magnified hundreds or thousands of times. And it's either really, really chronic, like domestic violence that you're witnessing at home every day, or really, really severe. Maybe it's not that you lost a loved one, but maybe your own life was threatened in some way, or you were injured significantly. Well, the impact from that experience is going to be magnified even beyond what we all experience in these individual moments when we experience great stress. And this can really impact the way our brain works. So in terms of academic performance, what the research tells us is that many of the foundational skills that kids need to do well in school can be impacted. And one of the reasons why is because that heightened state that we're all in when we experience the slings and arrows of daily life, for many kids that have experienced these really adverse experiences, they're in that state all the time. They perceive threat almost everywhere they are. Even though in most of our schools we know they're very safe. Kids are actually very safe in school. It doesn't mean that kids who have been traumatized are perceiving the safety in that environment. They might be, and in fact in many cases are perceiving threat. And that feeling of threat places them in the very state that we've all experienced momentarily, that they can be in that state for all or most of the school day. I want to share with you another study that pertains to the first bullet point on this slide. And it's a study that kind of documents the lived experience that we all have when we're in these heightened states of stress. Some researchers in Boston had a sample of folks who had been traumatized. I believe they were women. They had been victims of violence. And as kind of odd as this sounds, what they did is they connected the women to brainstem. They did functional MRIs of their brains while they were being reminded of their traumatic experiences. And then they looked at what happened in their brain. And there's an area of the brain called Broca's area, B-R-O-C-H-A, Broca's area, that's responsible for abstract language and abstract language processing and production. And what they found on the MRIs was that when people were reminded of their traumatic experience, when they were placed back through memory in that stressful moment, their Broca's area deactivated. And you know what area of the brain lit up like fireworks? The limbic system. The part of our brain that is the fight, flight, or freeze. The reptilian part of our brain. Where we react in the moment, but we don't have a lot of deliberate control over our actions. And this explains why when we're in these stressful moments, we can't think of the right thing to say. Because that area of our brain gets deactivated so that we can respond to the threat and keep ourselves safe, so that the organism can survive in a stressful situation. Our brains are wired to do that. From an evolutionary perspective, it's what makes us survive. We react to threat. But what happens is that our frontal lobes, the parts of our brains that we need for moral reasoning and to have deliberate control over our actions, become undermined in those stressful moments. In addition to the underlying skills, what the studies show is a process of learning, particularly what we call the executive functions, can be undermined. Executive functions are the ability to set a goal, devise a plan, carry out the plan, and then reflect on the plan, or how it went, the success or failure of what you did. Basically, the architecture of every assignment kids have to do in school, particularly as they advance into grades and they use more independence in their work. This whole process can be really undermined for kids. The next major category was classroom behavior. And I should say that the way this project got started was when our state, back in 1994, passed some very onerous, from our point of view, school discipline laws, which for the first time gave principals, school principals in Massachusetts, the authority to expel kids for certain behaviors. This authority had previously been reserved for school committees, which is what we call school boards in Massachusetts. Well, not surprisingly, once you give this authority to principals, who are in the crucible of community interactions and the politics of the school community, when kids do something not so great and the other parents are in your office and telling you to get that kid out, I mean, principals are under intense pressure. And we saw the school expulsion rates and suspension rates as well go way up in Massachusetts. Well, at MAC, which operates a statewide intake hotline for parents to call when they're having legal issues related to their kids' education, what the attorneys started to see was that there was a common thread underlying many of these kids whose behaviors had gotten them suspended or expelled from school. And that underlying thread was that there had been some form of traumatic experience. And so the attorneys were starting to realize this at just about the same time that some of these neurobiological studies were coming out. You know, it wasn't until the 90s, the mid to late 90s, that we had these sophisticated brain imaging technologies that we could really understand what was going on in people's brains and the impact that these experiences were having. And so the insights from the neurobiology and the insights from what the attorneys were seeing on the ground led us to understand how important this topic was. But it was the behaviors that were putting these kids on the attorney's radar screen. The point I want to make here about this slide is that there's a spectrum of behavioral impacts that trauma can have. So yes, it's the aggressive and defiant kids who are really desperately trying to exert some agency over an environment that they may perceive to be very chaotic and threatening, but they're doing that in aggressive ways. But it can also be the kid who's withdrawing. I actually have a case right now, a family that I'm working with, a third grader who's been sexually abused, and she actually spends most of her school day dissociating. You guys know what dissociation is? It's where we remove ourselves sort of mentally from the physical, the presence that we're in, and our mind goes off somewhere else. It's to distance ourselves from the fear or the threat or the pain. Well, when she's sitting there in her third grade class dissociating, do you think the reading lesson is sinking in? Do you think she's learning her math facts and her math reasoning? Of course not. She's off somewhere else. But to the educators, all they see is a kid who's behaving, who's sitting there being very quiet, and she does what's asked of her. But there's all this stuff going on inside that you can't see. Then there's also the perfectionists. The kids who think, if I just am perfect, I can make the adults okay. If I can just be good, I can make all the bad stuff around me stop. They can look very good on the surface, but again, lots of stuff going on inside. That brings us to relationships. And for me, as I was learning about this topic, I mean, this was sort of the category that was the most intuitive. I mean, it makes sense, particularly if the source of trauma are the caregivers that a child is supposed to trust, and that trust has been undermined. It stands to reason that that child might have difficulty forming trusting relationships with others. It's just intuitive, at least to me. But this can also extend to relationships with peers. And so relationships are a really important area that can be done. So a lot of what we spend time doing with educators is trying to redirect the misunderstanding that the learning, behavior, and relationship challenges these kids face can often create. And so what this slide attempts to demonstrate is what the student's perspective might be, but what that looks like to the adults in the school. Now I want to just stop here and say, it is not our contention that every instance of bad behavior by a student in school is explained by a traumatic experience that student has had. That is not our contention. Nor is it our contention that the answer to this problem, which I'm going to get to later, is that you just take away the consequences and just let kids behave the way they behave. That would be foolish. But what we do say is that for many kids, traumatic explanations might underlie the behaviors that you're seeing in school or the way they're presenting, at least to the extent that it's good to have that on sort of your decision tree or your differential diagnosis of the problem. It's important that we begin to start to ask the question when we see a child behaving in a certain way, could there be a traumatic element to this child's background? And maybe in school, sometimes we know the answer to that question, sometimes we'll never know. It's not really the school's job necessarily to ask that question. There are other state apparatuses that get into that. It's also not our contention that schools should become DCS and inquire into kids' backgrounds. But it's just something important to keep in mind. Because the problem that can result is that unintentionally, a lot of impressions of kids can get formed on the basis of the behaviors and learning challenges that we present with. And that can have a really big impact on students down the road. And here I want to get back to the case study for a second, because what the case study also did was correlate the experiences of the study participants with their health outcomes later in life. These were all members of the Kaiser HMO, so the investigators had access to all of their medical records. And what they found was that the more ACEs a person had, exponentially, the more likely they were to have all kinds of poor health outcomes in adulthood. Diabetes, heart disease, obesity, all kinds of health problems, cancer. And what they also found was that those health problems were mediated by health risk-taking behaviors. This is the middle purple layer of what they call the ACE pyramid. These health risk-taking behaviors are things like substance abuse, promiscuity, overeating. They're things that all of us do when we're stressed and anxious to calm ourselves down or to make ourselves feel better. And that underlying those risk-taking behaviors were what they call social, emotional, and cognitive impairments. The kinds of impacts that I was just talking about on the prior slides. And you see over here on the side it says scientific gaps. When they envisioned this pyramid initially, it was back in the mid to late 90s, that was before a lot of these neurobiological studies had come out. But now we have the studies, and so the gaps are much narrower than they were when they first envisioned this pyramid. So what you see here is sort of a diagram of what amounts to be a major public health problem in the United States. And yet it's one that, most of the people in this room hadn't heard of the study. Why are we not talking about this? We think we should be talking about this, and that schools are a place to talk about it. Why? Because what institution in our society is better positioned to address kids' social, emotional, and cognitive difficulties? That's schools. I can't think of another institution that's designed to do that. Schools are where kids are. And so we think not only does this lay out a public health problem, but it shows where in the pyramid schools are uniquely positioned to play a fulfilling role for kids. Okay, moving along. Idea number 3. So 1 and 2. This is the problem. The prevalence of adverse experiences and the traumatic impacts that flow from those experiences are the social problem that our project is trying to address. Now let's talk about the solution. Core idea number 3 is that what we call trauma-sensitive schools can help children feel safe so they can learn. We want to talk here about what a trauma-sensitive school is. We have a definition. We say a trauma-sensitive school is one in which all students feel safe, welcomed, and supported, and where addressing trauma's impact on learning on a school-wide basis is at the center of its educational mission. And in a minute, I'm going to sort of deconstruct what some of the concepts are in this definition, but what I want to say first is that we didn't just sit around and come up with this definition. What we did is work with schools that saw this problem and proactively wanted to try to figure out how to create an environment that would address it with their students. And from all of the schools that we work with, we tried to sort of create an amalgam of what's the common underlying definition that seems to be present in all of these schools that are doing really great work on trauma sensitivity. And this is what we came up with. What I want to do next is show you a video. And don't click it just yet, Patrick. I'll let you know. I want to just give it a bit of context first. This is a school, actually in San Diego. It has nothing to do with the A study, but we're spending a lot of time in San Diego. This is a school, an elementary school in San Diego called the Cherokee Point School. And the principal of this school is a man named Godwin Higgin. And he has gone about, he's not at all affiliated with our project, but the video just happens to be a really good video, so that's why I'm showing it. But he has created what he calls a trauma-informed school. And this is about a 5-6 minute video, and I want to show it to you, and then we're going to talk about it and see what we think about the Cherokee Point School in San Diego. Patrick, would you click it?
When you say, do you know what trauma-informed schools are? No. They know the word trauma. That's it. They think of the trauma unit at the hospital, not realizing that trauma is deep inside your brain.
Do we fight at recess? No. Do we respect our teacher? Yes. Does the teacher respect you? Yes. So this is a very special school because last year we had no suspension. Did you know that? I did not send anybody home. Understanding the whole child, where they're coming from, how we treat students with respect is trauma-informed philosophy. It's about relating to the students and really opening your heart. This is more than just making a crane, isn't it? It's like teaching you how to be friends and how to help each other.
compassion and looking at the whole child and really looking at what can I do to help this child with the things that he or she needs.
Pues una escuela informada sobre el trauma es una comunidad que está abierta a aprender, a compartir sus historias. Es una comunidad que puede salir adelante, que puede formar niños sanos, niños felices, niños contentos.
The big message is we cannot continue to be punitive in education.
Are you enjoying school? Oh, good. That's the main thing.
Instead of asking students what's wrong with you, we need to ask our students what's happened to you.
Y el informar sobre el trauma, vas más atrás bueno, el niño es así, pero ¿por qué? ¿Qué está pasando en sus casas? ¿Qué está pasando con su familia? ¿Qué está pasando en su entorno? Y cuando conoces esas historias detrás de esa persona o del trasfondo de esas situaciones, te hace más sensible.
We have many homeless students. Most of our students are English learners. There's a lot of domestic abuse in our community. When they come in and they sit down at their desks and they have their breakfasts and they watch an educational video, they know they're safe here.
I'm from a family of domestic violence, and I was 2 years old, and I remember the ball hitting the wall. Your little kids that you're dealing with right now, they will remember what's happening.
Y tal vez su mal comportamiento es un grito de ayúdenme.
We want to make sure that when you're angry or sad, we want to help you through that.
Are you guys friends?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, you have to remember, friends don't fight. Friends are nice to each other, right?
Yeah, okay. Okay.
I think the most important thing that we can do is sit and talk to each other. Instead of continuing to get in trouble and ending up in our jail systems, they know how to deal with the controversy in their life.
Y el demostrar que el drama no te puede tener para nada. El amor, la comprensión, siempre va a ganar y triunfar para vivir mejor, vivir una vida feliz.
What are we doing as educators? Are we really understanding where our students are coming from? It really makes me passionate about the trauma-informed school setting. The goal here is to make policy changes.
Look at all the birds coming alive.
We can make the change. You can make the change. I know deep in my heart that this is the way to go.
Thank you. So what I want to do next is just take a couple minutes for you to turn to your neighbor and just chat with each other about what you just saw. And here's what I want you to think about. Now, granted, this was just a 5-minute video, right? It only gives us a snapshot of the school. But at least insofar as what we were able to see about the school, what struck you? What observable features about the school made it seem safe and supportive or trauma sensitive to you? What could you observe? What could you hear? Either that's the same as what every school does, or that's different from what some schools do. What struck you? What characteristics of the school stood out to you? So take just 2 or 3 minutes, turn to your neighbor, and talk about that. And then Suzanne is going to come around with a microphone, and we're just going to hear some reactions to what we saw in the video.
The language, like he said, asking what's wrong with you, what's happening.
They were talking.
In conversation,
It was conversational. It wasn't. Didn't want to speak in your position. They said, I haven't let anybody go. We're still.
and yet he's still letting you know that it's
Yeah, but it was out of
challenges you. It's not, oh, they have a different opinion. How do I communicate in a way? It's, oh, you're against me. Yeah.
I thought the other issue was around the there's not, there was a teacher, there was a resource teacher, there was a student, but there clearly was some parent involved. It appears to be a student.
It seems like there's a lot of blaming in other places, and it didn't seem like they had blaming.
That's a good point.
There's one of the cartoons that I like is looking at maybe a class in the 70s, and everyone's looking at the students saying, "Get your act together." And in the 80s, it was get to the parents, "Hey, get your act together." And now it's all focused on the teacher. "Hey, get your act together." And who's the one who's able to change the most? Well, the student is the only person that can control themselves. And if you teach them, then the parents have to role model and have to sort of display those things, and then the teachers have to reinforce it. And they had experiences with that, so it's not. I don't see the work. Yeah. Yes, it's what?
This is not.
Yeah.
That is not. It's not that way.
Yeah.
So I know this hasn't been a lot of time. Let's take 30 seconds.
Their summers off.
Finish the conversation. And then we'll come back together.
Yeah.
Because the other most precious thing we're dealing with is our students. Don't tread on them.
Right. And the idea that you can't focus on just one child. People really wonder that why aren't you giving my attention? Well, I've got 35 other people, and there's some with higher needs and some with lower needs. They're all, the numbers are 50% dealing with trauma, and really,
Now what I'd like to do next is just have a couple folks share your reaction, if you're willing to do so. We don't have time for more than 2 or 3. And actually what I'd like you to refrain from doing, because I'll save this for the end, is, if you want to, challenge everything I've been saying to you, or poke holes in everything I'm saying, don't do that now. We'll get to that at the end. And I welcome skeptical questions. What I want to hear right now is folks who would like to share something you observed about the video, a characteristic of the school that stood out to you. So if you're willing to share that, please raise your hand, and there's a microphone that will come around. We'll hear from you. So we have a hand up here. Thank you.
I teach high school English around Kokomo, Allen County. And from what we've been taught, it's don't touch the kids because you can get in trouble. And the thing that stood out to me, and I know, a lot of our kids do not get loving touches. And that's what stood out to me.
That's a really interesting point. And I had not observed that about this video, but you're right. There's a lot of hands on kids in very caring ways in this video. And what that reminds me of, I have this very strong memory. When I was in college, I spent a summer working in a daycare. And there were these 2 brothers that I now know in retrospect, there was absolutely domestic violence going on in that home. And the younger boy would always want to come and sit in my lap. I mean, he wanted to be touched. He craved that touch. And I didn't know what to do about that. It felt kind of awkward and weird to me. But I now have an understanding for maybe why that was. So you're absolutely right. That is a salient, observable feature of this school, but one that I had not thought about before. Yes, in the back.
Well, I noticed obviously the happy, upbeat, the happy, upbeat sense of the whole thing, and it looks like a very nice place to go to school. But I didn't see anything in there that touches on when something hard is happening, right? So anyone who has a happy school seems like a happy school, but does that mean everything's going right?
Really, really good point. It's easy to be all safe and supportive and caring when everything is going along and smooth sailing. But what about the crisis point? What happens when the fight has just broken out? How does Hugo respond when that fight happens? I mean, there's the little quibble between the boy and the girl. I mean, we can well imagine many situations in the school that escalate far beyond whatever their misunderstanding was. What does that look like? The video doesn't show that. You're absolutely right. That's an important question. Yes, here in the middle.
I would say that the principal definitely was building a culture, and you could help hear him telling the story, the narrative of the school is that we don't suspend kids, we don't fight. And I think that a lot of the positive energy that you saw in the video is probably attributed to just the culture of the school. And so hopefully having that kind of culture, you can prevent a lot of things and kind of take prophylactic measures versus reactive measures.
That's a great point, and you just, this man is not a plant in the audience, but the point you made is just the perfect segue to what I want to talk about next, which is that when you add it all up, what's great, at least the parts of the video that we saw, and you're right, there wasn't a crisis happening, we didn't get to see that, but at least in the moments we saw, at least for me, when I watched the video, there's a really tangible culture that you can see happening in this school. And really, that's what we mean when we talk about trauma sensitivity. It's the culture in the school that makes all the difference. And so that's an important insight, but it can also be vexing, because how the hell do you create that culture? I mean, to recognize that culture plays a big role is not the same as knowing as an educator or as a school leader, what do I do to get that culture in my school? So one of the tasks that we've undertaken as a project is to try to deconstruct what are the attributes of the school that add up to that definition that was on the slide that I showed you before the video. And the way that we did that was by working in many schools in Massachusetts, watching them fumble around, experiment, but with their hearts in the right place and with a focus on trauma sensitivity. And then we said, what are the common threads that ran through all of these schools that seemed to work well? And we came up with 6 of them. We call them the attributes of a trauma-sensitive school. And they're an attempt to put some meat on the bones of what this cultural piece is that makes a school trauma-sensitive. The first of these attributes is that leadership and staff share an understanding of trauma's impact on learning and the need for a whole school approach. This has to go beyond the school counselor's office, because the school counselor isn't the one breaking up the fight in the lunchroom necessarily, or meeting out the disciplinary consequences in the assistant principal's office or something. Everybody in the school has to understand this social phenomenon and the impact that it can have on kids. The second attribute, the school supports all students to feel safe, physically, socially, emotionally, and academically. And I want to linger on this one and make 2 points. The first is that it's all students. This isn't about singling out those students who have had adverse experiences and doing something different for them. This is about creating a culture where all kids in the school feel safe. And the reason this is so important is because, as I said before, as schools, we're not always going to know which of the kids in our classrooms have had these experiences. It's important to design the culture universally, assuming, because as we just saw, the rates are 50%, assuming that the kids in our schools are going to have, some number of them have had these experiences and are suffering the impacts. And let's design a culture that assumes that and makes an environment that's safe for all kids. The second point I want to make is this last one. When we think about safety, when you think about school safety, what's the first thing that pops into your mind? Either a school resource officer or a metal detector. That's what we tend to think about when we think of safety. But we want to really expand the notion of what it means to feel safe in the school. And even academically, to learn, kids have to feel safe to take risks. They have to feel safe to raise their hand and offer an answer to the question, to go up to the board and try to work out a math problem, or to read out loud when it's time for oral reading. Kids who are scared don't have access to those experiences, so we've got to make them feel academically safe. And here's the other point about academic safety. The worst, and I do mean the worst thing we can do, is lower our expectations for kids because we know that they've had some experience. Because do you know why? What does that do? Lowering the expectations reinforces the very shameful thing that that child has come to believe about themselves. And when they see the adults lowering expectations, well, you don't have to do your homework tonight, or we're going to give you, a different assignment than everybody else. You have just reinforced, you have just proven to them that the very thing they think about themselves is true. And that's very damaging to a child. So this gets back to this notion of academic safety. You've got to help all kids feel safe to take these risks and see themselves as learners. Oops. Third attribute. I'm jumping all around. The school addresses students' needs in holistic ways, including their relationships, self-regulation, academic competence, and physical and emotional well-being. And this really, at least, from my point of view, and I'm biased here, but I think this is where some of the laws and regulations, particularly coming from the federal government, some of which we talked about this morning, the testing, No Child Left Behind, has really gotten in the way of trauma sensitivity, because it's driven our focus solely to those achievement scores, when we know that the whole child is so much more. And trauma-sensitive schools find ways, even amidst all of the mandates that they're suffering under, to support the whole child. Fourth attribute. The school explicitly connects students to the school community and provides multiple opportunities to practice skills. I'm a special editor, so I spend a lot of time helping parents obtain for their kids the services that they're entitled to under federal and state law. Many of those services are delivered outside the classroom, in the school psychologist's office, or the speech pathologist's office, or the occupational therapist's office, and they're learning great skills. Those professionals are doing great jobs teaching our kids these skills, but they never bridge it back into the whole school environment. A trauma-sensitive school finds ways to take those skills that some kids need extra support outside the classroom to learn. But a trauma-sensitive school figures out ways to connect those students back to the school community. The fundamental experience of trauma is of being disconnected from your community. It's being so hurt or so unsafe that you're not able to make connections with your fellow members of your community. We've got to use our services in schools to help bridge kids back and help them connect to the culture of the school, connect to the other kids and the adults in the building. The fifth attribute, the school embraces teamwork, and staff share responsibility for all students. So it's not about, well, that kid isn't in my class, so I'm not going to intervene, or I'm not going to, just break up the fight, or say a kind word, or take responsibility for what I see happening. In trauma-sensitive schools, all kids belong to everybody. And we all share a sense of teamwork and camaraderie. And here's the other reason why this is important. How many of you have heard the concept of vicarious trauma, or secondary trauma, or compassion fatigue? Another way of saying the same thing. Those of us in helping professions, when we work with folks that have all of these experiences and these impacts, it can be very draining. It's a very hard work. And if we don't all band together and support each other, it's impossible to do. We have to be a team. And so that's a really critical component of a trauma-sensitive school. The sixth attribute. Leadership and staff anticipate and adapt to the ever-changing needs of students. Now, the thing that we encounter in Boston and some other urban cities a lot is, a whole new influx of immigrants from a new place. When the earthquake happened in Haiti, lots of those families immigrated to a city called Brockton, Massachusetts. Brockton is one of the districts where we do a lot of work. And the schools had to adapt to that, because not only did you have students who were coming from a different cultural experience, many of whom didn't speak English, but they had all just been through this horrible experience. What do you do as a school when that happens? Or when a homeless shelter opens up down the street and now all those kids are coming to your school. Part of trauma sensitivity is being, just assuming that there are going to be changes coming down the pipe, or we're going to get a new superintendent, or there's going to be changes in the leadership. We've got to adapt. So those are the 6 attributes of trauma sensitivity. We are engaged in a research study right now with the American Institutes for Research in Washington, D.C., in which we are working in 5 Massachusetts schools. We're not disclosing their identities yet because we want them to be safe and protected as they do this work. But they're working with our team to create trauma-sensitive schools, and then we're going to try to measure these elements of school culture and see whether engaging in a process to become trauma-sensitive actually results in observable changes in these 6 areas. So this is kind of a new kind of research. We asked AIR, who are like the big researchers, right? Who's done really great work on measuring and documenting changes in school culture? And they said, we really don't know of many studies that have done that. So we hope to be able to add some methodology here to how do you know whether a culture is changing in the school? How can you see it and document it? I'm going to check my time here. As usual, oh gosh, okay. Well, we're going to go fast through the last 2 ideas and then hopefully have some time for reactions. So we've got the problem, we've got the solution, but how are we going to get there? Discussion we've just been having. Trauma sensitivity requires a whole school effort. You can't change the culture in a school by just hiring another mental health professional. It requires everybody in the school to be on board. But again, it's easy to say that, much, much harder to do it. And so what we've tried to do is devise some tools that can actually help educators create this kind of whole school change that we're talking about. The first idea here, I'm going to skip through this. I'm just going to go back and look at the definition again, but oh gosh, there we go. Too fast. There we go. Educators need a process to help them integrate trauma sensitivity into the educational mission of the school. Remember the definition said this is part of the core educational mission of the school. Well, you don't just wave a magic wand and do that. It takes a process. And so we go into the literature again and learn about how organizations change themselves. And believe it or not, a lot of the best research about this comes out of business. I know a lot of us in the education field feel like enough from the business community, like let us just be educators, let us just educate kids. But it turns out that at least in academic settings, the field that has done the most and the best research about how organizational cultures get formed and how to change them are business schools. And what we've learned from that literature is that using an inquiry-based process to address the concerns of educators in the building, not something imposed from the outside, but how do we address the concerns educators have and design locally tailored solutions to those concerns. That's the way you start to change a culture. And so, again, borrowing from concepts from organizational change literature, we have a 4-step, we're not calling them steps, but 4 questions that form the structure of a process any school can go through. The first question is, why do we feel an urgency to become a trauma-sensitive school? If there's no motivation among the leadership or the staff of a school to understand trauma or care about it or become trauma-sensitive, you're not getting off first base in that school. It only makes sense to think about and talk about creating a trauma-sensitive school in places where the educators have encountered this issue, understand that it's something that's affecting their kids and want to do something about it. When that urgency is there, the second question becomes relevant. How do we know we're ready to create a trauma-sensitive school? Urgency alone does not mean you're ready to be successful. We worked at a school in an urban environment in Massachusetts where there had just been some restructuring. And they had put 2 schools together into one school. And the leaders of the school really wanted to do trauma sensitivity. They were gung-ho. But what happened was, you had 2 big factions on the faculty who really didn't like each other and were not happy about the fact that their school had just been put together. So we had to say to those school leaders, you know what, you're not ready. Because not for any reason to do with trauma sensitivity, but your faculty is just not getting along with each other. You're not ready to embark on a culture change process yet. So that's one example of readiness or lack thereof. When you're ready, the next and third question is, what actions will address staff priorities, the things we care urgently about in our school, and help us become a trauma-sensitive school? Now, what are some of these urgencies? Maybe it's that we're suspending too many kids. We want to work on school discipline. Maybe it's that we have kids dropping out We have a dropout problem in our school. We want to engage more kids. Maybe it's that, we've tried really hard to reach out to families, but they're just not coming. We don't know what to do. That's an urgent problem we want to address. This process is how can we move forward on that issue that we care about, but do so in a way that's going to move our school culture closer to trauma sensitivity. And then the fourth question, how do we know we're becoming a trauma-sensitive school? Are we going to look at our test scores, and if they don't go up, we're going to say, well, that trauma sensitivity thing didn't work because the scores didn't go up in a year. Well, you know what, they're probably not going to go up. But what can you look at? What are the observable things? And here's where our research comes into play that we hope will be helpful. How can you look at your school culture and know it's making a difference, the efforts that you're taking? What's the data that matters to you as educators? Not necessarily the data that the policymakers care about. How are you going to know whether you're being successful in your school? And then the circle spirals. This isn't a one and done. The idea is to really change your culture. You spiral through this process continually, and it just becomes the way you do business in a school. That's when you become trauma. One more tool I want to share with you that we've created for educators, and this is going to bridge us into the policy discussion, but unfortunately I'm going to have to rush through. Here's the other thing. Educators need a framework to help them weave trauma sensitivity through all the operations of the school. And here's what I mean by school operations. Again, this is what we learned from schools. That there's 6 major areas of school operations that are ubiquitous, they are universal, they're in every school. And if you want to do anything, whether it's trauma sensitivity or anything else on a school-wide basis, you're going to have to contend with these 6 things. And there might be more than 6, but at the very least, there are these 6. What is the role of leadership? What is the leader in the school going to do to help move this initiative forward? What professional development do you need? What access to resources and services? What about academic and non-academic strategies? And by this we really mean classroom strategy, the teaching and learning function. How does that need to change, or does it need to change in any way to support whatever the school-wide initiative is that we're trying to implement? Policies, procedures, and protocols. And what I want to say here is, and I copted this as a lawyer, that as lawyers, the easiest one of these 5 for us to do is to come up with the policy. The mandate, the thing you must do. But of course, we all know policies are not self-executing. A policy is only as good as the culture that exists to ensure that the policy gets implemented. So that's why policy is an important one. It's number 5, but it is not the whole ball of wax, not even close. And then finally, you can barely see it, the collaboration with families. And one of the features of that Higa video that I found really striking was that somehow he got parents talking about trauma in a very non-stigmatizing way, which is hard to do because there's such a stigma associated with trauma. I have to say that's an area where we have not pushed the envelope as much in the schools where we work with. In fact, we teach educators to tread really lightly about what they call what they do, because calling it trauma can often result in all kinds of pushback from the community. But Higa seems to have done it very well. But it's important, no matter what you call it, it's important to collaborate with families. Okay, this brings us to the 5th and final idea. And I know we're coming up short on time. Let's do another check. Okay, 5 minutes. Well, we're going to do our best. The 5th idea is that in our view, helping traumatized children learn should become a major focus of education reform. And what I want to share just the briefest snippet with you about is how we're trying to do that in Massachusetts. So the first thing, and I suppose as lawyers we learn this the hard way, is the insight that you can't legislate people to care about a certain issue, or to feel a certain way, or to feel, you can't mandate people to feel a certain way. Going back to that first question of urgency, you can't legislate urgency. So what we don't want to do is pass a law that says, thou shalt become a trauma-sensitive school. Because we don't think that that is sustainable. It will become a mere compliance mechanism, a checklist that somebody checks off, and it won't really get to the heart and soul of the school. So what we've got to do is ask a different question. Which is, what role, if any, can law and policy play in setting the conditions that allow for good holistic practice? So in the schools that catch this spark, that have this urgency to become trauma sensitive, how can we make sure that there's a legal and policy regime in place that actually helps them do that? and, first and foremost, gets out of the way and lets them do that? This is the question that they're asking. And in Massachusetts, we've gone about this in a certain way. And I don't know if Indiana is like Massachusetts, but in Massachusetts, we have a legislature that loves to give new mandates to schools. So it seems like every year there's a new flavor du jour, right? One year it was bullying because we had suicides in our state, and we were one of the last states to not have a bullying prevention and intervention law. So we had 2 suicides in the span of a year, and the legislature said we got to do something about this. And you know what they did? They did have to do something about it. But so they created a whole new set of mandates for schools about bullying, as well they should. But you know what? The year before that it was truancy reduction, and the year before that it was mental health needs of children in schools, and then since then it's been dropout prevention and all other kinds of things, not to mention teacher evaluation regs and all of the laws they were passing so that they could get a waiver from No Child Left Behind and get Race to the Top money and all of that stuff. All of these mandates. And so what you see here are some of these laws that Massachusetts has passed. And our approach was to say, how can we bring all of these things together? Schools, at least in Massachusetts, feel this onslaught of new laws as like balls that they're trying to juggle. And there's this thing circulating now called the superintendent's checklist. And it's all the laws and regulations that superintendents are responsible for making sure to implement. It's 7.5 pages long, a bullet point list. They're saying to the legislature, we can't keep doing this. You can't give us more. We're at our capacity. We're a saturated sponge. So our insight is, let's go back to that frame, school operations. What if we started to take all of these mandates, and we need them. We can't not have a bullying law. I mean, that wouldn't be right. But how can we take all of these mandates and structure them so that they mirror the way the school operates? So that when every one of these laws comes down, we're asking ourselves questions in these 6 areas. What does leadership need to do? What professional development do we need? Access to resources and supports. And what that then does is allow schools to have a structure to work in. Or gosh, you know what? That social emotional learning professional development we're required to do actually is going to teach a lot of the same things that we need to teach to prevent bullying. So we can have an efficiency there. We don't need to have 2 separate coordinators doing 2 separate trainings and then the twain shall meet. We can do it together. And having a common structure to work in, we think, sets a condition that makes it easier for schools to do all the things we seem to now want them to do and that they probably should be doing, but in a way that makes it non-manageable. So what I want to point out is these circles that have black circles around them are acts of our legislature. The ones that are colored in but that don't have black circles are actions taken by our state administrative agencies or policy or guidance. And then here at the bottom are just a few of the district level policies that have incorporated this structure that's based on school operations. And so gradually, we're trying to expand this and create a regime that's just easier for schools to work with. You'll see the circle around the outside says Safe and Supportive Schools Framework. In 2014, our legislature, as part of an omnibus gun violence reduction legislation, included a section of that large statute that we had been advocating for as a bill called the Safe and Supportive Schools Statute. So now codified in Massachusetts law is a statute that says, here's going to be the framework for what safe and supportive schools are in our state, of which trauma-sensitive schools are one strand, but a safe and supportive school is a bigger umbrella. Again, we can't just legislate trauma sensitivity, but maybe what we can say is we need a safe and supportive schools framework that's going to help schools do all the various things that come under that umbrella, whether it's homeless education, that was mentioned, or dropout prevention, or truancy reduction, or the needs of kids with mental health issues, or trauma sensitivity. Let's give schools a common framework to work in, and we don't have one in Massachusetts. The law does some other things, but I run out of time to share the details with you. But the point is, we can't legislate urgency, but we hope to be able to set some conditions that make it easier for schools to do the kind of work we want them to do. So I'm going to stop there. And I don't know, do we have any time for questions, or do we need to close up here? What's the verdict?
We have time for some questions.
Okay.
We can get the microphones around again.
Okay, so now is when you can like push back and like ask me what you want to know or poke holes, and I'll do my best.
The next panel has 3:15, so let's just do a few questions.
All right, maybe two to three.
If 50% of your students have an adverse childhood experience, then 50% of your teachers do too. And that presents like a two-pronged problem because they're going to say, well, I learned to cope with it, these kids should. And also, that survival thinking that people come up with causes them to nod and agree and say they're going to do stuff and then not do stuff.
Both really great points. And again, we learned particularly the first one the hard way. One of the first principals that we worked with was in a suburb of Springfield, Massachusetts, which is our third largest city in our state. And he wanted to roll this out on a school-wide basis. A really great school leader, really thoughtful guy. It was an elementary school. He was doing great. And he was doing things like, putting snippets about readings from our book in the weekly school newsletter, trying to see the interest. It was all building up to a faculty meeting in February, where he was going to sort of launch this school-wide initiative. And what he found after the faculty meeting was that there were three groups of teachers in the school. The first group were the choir, we like to call it, like the ones that you're preaching to the choir, they were on board, they wanted this. In fact, they were the ones that had brought the idea of trauma sensitivity to him. They were great, they were on board. The second group were just the ones who are going to go along, they're not going to make a fuss, they're not necessarily invested, but they'll just go along to get along. But there was a third group, and he called them his edgies. They were the teachers that had exactly the reaction you described. I don't know why we need to do this, they need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. Well, as time went on, what started to happen was that those who were the edgies came into his office and started to disclose, gosh, this happened to me when I was a kid. I pulled myself up. I don't understand why these kids can't. I think we're selling them short, if we dumb it down or if we do something special for them. So it was a really interesting phenomenon, at least in that one school, was that it was, people that had had some of these experiences that were the ones who were most resistant to change initially. Over time, at least in that school, the other two groups were larger, and then he created a very safe space for those teachers to resist and to make their voice heard, and so eventually they got on board. This goes back to the second question in the process, which is readiness. And if that third group of edgies is too big in any given school, you're not going to make it.